Good morning, everyone. Today, I'm here at Seven Pines National Cemetery to bring you a little bit of a different video than what I usually do. So today, I want to go ahead and discuss the different kinds of headstones that you'll find. Particularly in this case, I want to discuss the different kind of headstones that you would find at, say, a national cemetery or really any cemetery, particularly related to military graves. In this situation, there are actually a number of different types, and as you can already see, there's different symbolisms with each type that you will see. So first, I'll cover some of the early renditions that we would often see, and then go on from there to discuss the different little nitty-gritty details while we go ahead and go through the cemetery and see some of the different burials that are offered here at this cemetery. First, we'll go ahead and discuss what these particular things are. These are plot markers. Simple as that. In fact, I've talked about this a little bit before when I talked about Oakwood Cemetery. Oakwood Cemetery has similar markers like this. However, in the case of the national cemeteries that you'll often find, especially older ones like Seven Pines, Cold Harbor, Glendale, etc., and so forth, they have quite a large number of these particular style of plot markers, which they identify which particular burial you're at in the cemetery, and often identify burials that aren't properly marked, as you would see over here with the ones just directly in front of us. And sometimes they'll include different numberings, which, from what I can gather, I don't know the specific meaning behind them, but it could usually represent how many particular people or individuals are buried in that plot, which is something that does happen, especially in these older cemeteries, because of the nature of the foundation of these cemeteries. These cemeteries were founded in the late war years, 1865 to be specific, as part of a general plan to honor and recognize the sacrifices made by Union troops during the American Civil War. And as you can see here, you would often have what we would consider to be today a mass burial, which, if you don't know what the definition of that is, it essentially means that there is more than one body buried in one grave. And the reason why this was the case has to do with how many of these remains were found and what state they were in. Most of them, by the time they were recovered from the battlefield, were skeletal remains. They couldn't be identified, which is why you have so many unknown men. Because prior to the development of dog tags and other identification measures, you couldn't really identify who was buried there outside of what clothing they might have wore at the time, to be able to at least guess at what unit they may have belonged to. And as a result, you often had a large number of burials where there would be multiple skeletal remains buried in the same plot, though this is something that they eventually would shy away from, especially after most of these general recovery efforts were done. But this is a part of the reason why these cemeteries exist in the first place, is due to these large numbers of unidentified remains. So as a result, they would create cemeteries like what you see before you here at Seven Pines National Cemetery, what you would see at Cold Harbor, Glendale, etc., and so forth. Now we'll talk about some of the other headstone designs that you might actually already see right in front of you. This first headstone that you see in front of you is a good example of one of the identified burials, and also demonstrates the different types of markers that you would often see with these earlier headstone designs. Now, you'll notice immediately there's a particular shape that's carved into the headstone, which is the shape of a shield. That is a identifier. It specifically represents the Grand Army of the Republic and the Union troops who fought during the American Civil War, and then later on during the Indian Wars, and all the way up until you reach the Spanish-American War. This is a symbol that is unique to that time period and represents men of those particular units that were formed during the war and then after the war, up until you reach the Spanish-American War. And as you can see already, there's something that you might also notice that's a bit different from the others. There's no date of death, nor any date of birth, nor are there any identifiers that would tell you where they were from outside of their regiment number. And that was a fairly typical way of addressing these different individuals. So in this case, we have a Solomon Forborough, who was from Pennsylvania. Specifically, he was a corporal of Company A, 23rd Pennsylvania Infantry. Alternatively, you have this particular marker that you see in front of you. This is one that identifies a unknown U.S. soldier, as you can see written on the headstone itself. Now, these sort of headstones don't have to represent necessarily one unknown soldier. You can actually have upwards of 4 to 5 unknown U.S. soldiers buried in a given plot, which again goes back to the original founding of these cemeteries and the remains, and the state of the remains that they were found in. Many of these remains were skeletal remains, and many of them were unidentifiable. So as a result, they would take them to these cemeteries and then bury them in a common pit or a common area, and then make sure that it is clearly and well-defined and well-marked that multiple burials are in a given location. Now in this case, more likely than not, the remains were found in a much better condition than skeletal remains, but they still couldn't be identified. In other words, they may have been, they had died recently, but there was nothing that could identify them to any particular unit, or their body was not in a state where it could be identified. So as a result, they would bury them here and mark them as unknown because their identity could not be identified. So we'll go ahead and continue on our little tour and see some of the other different headstone types that the cemetery has to offer, and to further understand the different types that we'll see later on. And here we start to notice a little bit of a difference as we get on through the years. This is the grave of a Joseph M. Lushborough, Lushborough, there we go. He was the first sergeant of Company K, 2nd Virginia Infantry. But now you notice something below there, which says Spanish-American War. That acronym down there, it stands for the Spanish-American War, which was fought in 1898. He, more likely than not, would have served with the United States military at that time, and that this headstone was representative of the fact that he had enlisted. There's also an additional date at the very bottom, which says July 21st, 1934. That is his date of death, which is something that is quite a stark difference from the other burials that we've seen before. Now you're starting to see a gradual change in evolution towards making sure that the records and identity of the person is better known compared to what you have previously, with only it being just the regiment that they fought in and their name. Now, that might not seem important, but for people who want to identify who they are, where they were born, when they died, so that they have a good record of what happened, it's not very useful to just have the regiment and the name. So the addition of which wars they fought in would come along, their date of death would come along, and then eventually you have more and more details added on later through the years. So after the Spanish-American War and the turn of the 20th century, we start to see another quite dramatic shift away from the original headstones that we had seen earlier. Gone are the days of the symbol of the Grand Army of the Republic, and now a standardized, federally designated headstone design is put into place. And there are a number of criteria that are met with it, which you can see here on the headstone of Charles B. Southworth. First, you have at the top the religion of the man who's buried here. He was a Christian, so therefore you have an image of a cross that's placed on top of it. If he were a Muslim or Jewish or some other religious belief, it would be a symbol that represents those beliefs, such as the Star of David for Jewish people and the crescent and the Islamic crescent for Islam. Then below that, you have his name, which is Charles B. Southworth. And then below that, you have his state, which is California. He was born and raised in California. Below that, we now have his rank as well as the unit he served in. So he was a corporal of Company C, 127th Engineers. Then below that, you have something that we start to see in some of the earlier ones, such as in the case of the ones related to the Spanish-American War, and that is the war that he fought in. He fought in World War I. And if the person had fought in multiple wars, you would have a list of multiple wars there. So World War I, World War II, and Korea, for instance. And then finally below that there, we finally have something that is quite important. We have their date of birth as well as their date of death. So in this case, we have his birth date was October the 11th, 1882, and he died on February 2nd, 1958. And then was eventually buried here at Seven Pines National Cemetery, along with a lot of others. And that's something that you'll notice that'll be quite common among a lot of these military headstones. Many of them did not necessarily die in war. They may have died in peacetime and requested to be buried here among their comrades, among the men that they had fought with, or in a place of reverence such as Seven Pines National Cemetery, in order to have their military service recognized. Now we'll move on to the final headstone that I wish to cover here, and we'll go ahead and wrap it up there. And finally, we wrap up here at the grave of Thomas H. Phelps. He was a colonel of the U.S. Army, born March 5th, 1961, and died November 14th, 2006. He fought in the Persian Gulf War and later on during the entire invasion of Iraq, otherwise known as Operation Iraqi Freedom, and the subsequent nation rebuilding that happened after that. However, he died on November 14th, 2006, after an IED exploded near his vehicle. He was brought back here to Richmond, Virginia, and buried in Seven Pines National Cemetery, where he lies to this day. He's one of the most recent burials in the cemetery, which, as of right now, is one of the many cemeteries that's slowly running out of room to bury these men. However, his headstone, along with his legacy, represents 150 plus years of United States military history overall. His headstone is a carryover of the traditions that were established during the American Civil War, and have slowly changed to become more informative, more knowledgeable, and more respectful to the individuals that are buried in these locations, to honor their legacy and their dignity in war. So, if you wish to visit any of the people buried here at Seven Pines National Cemetery, it is located here in Sandston, Virginia, just outside of the city of Richmond, about 9 miles outside of the city of Richmond, along Williamsburg Road. So, I hope everyone has a blessed day. Keep these men in your memories. Remember the sacrifices that they have made, and may God bless all of you.